What we're all here for is to hear from the member for Epping. I now call the member for Epping.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many people here today, and I'm sorry the seats were limited, but my family takes up about half the gallery. But that wasn't always the case, Mr. Speaker. When I came here with Helen for my maiden speech 13 years ago, we drove here in a Corolla. We're leaving in a minivan. But as Peter Costello said, one for mum, one for dad, and one for the country. But I went further and had one for every electorate I represented. And an extra one just in case the drive from Epping got too long. Now, Mr. Speaker, I still remember the first time I walked into this place and felt the gravity of being elected to the New South Wales Legislature, the oldest parliament in Australia. The reality is, no matter how long we are here for, we are only in this place for a very short time. I believe the best use of that short time is to do things that will stand the test of time. And over the past 13 years, whilst there's been highs and lows, I'm proud to have been part of a government that made good use of its time and fundamentally transformed New South Wales. We reshaped our city and our state in just over a decade and laid the foundations for a promising future. Think back to how Sydney was in 2011 compared to today. The city has changed dramatically thanks to our vision, our willingness to innovate, and our focus on putting people at the centre of our decisions. I don't believe that any government since Federation has ever built what we did, and no government probably ever will again. Yeah. Over the 12 years, our government took a Bradfield-like attitude to governing. From building Australia's longest road project in WestConnex and the longest road tunnel in NorthConnex, Metro Northwest, Metro City, Metro Southwest and Metro Western Sydney Airport. Light rail in our city and our west, and a second crossing under our harbour tunnel, the Western Harbour Tunnel. With schools, hospitals, galleries, museums, new convention centres, fish markets and stadiums to boot. We inherited one city and we created three. We live in the best city, in the best state in the world, and now with world-class infrastructure to match. And whilst our pace of building was second to none, we also revolutionised service delivery through Service New South Wales, a global success story that is now being emulated by other countries. This transformational agenda was there from the start until the end. Barrow Farrell laid the foundations for our government's investments. Mike Baird pioneered financial reforms that unlocked our state's potential, and without his vision, our state wouldn't be where it is today. Gladys Berejiklian led us through challenging times, including natural disasters and a once-in-a-century pandemic. But what sets me apart from them in a league of my own is that while they won elections, I lost them. But these leaders were supported by an incredible team of ministers, of MPs, of staffers, public servants, who can all be immensely proud of their contribution. The results of their hard work are visible today, and that story is still unfolding, as there are dozens and dozens of projects still to be opened over the next decade that will redefine our state. And from the bottom of my heart, I'd like to thank the current government for the enthusiasm that you have shown in turning up to all the opening ceremonies and cutting the ribbons on our behalf. You're very, very welcome. Obviously, Joe, I wrote that before you messed up the Metro opening. Now, Mr. Speaker, today I don't just want to talk about all the great things we did, because obviously we would be here well into the night. So instead, I want to share some lessons from my experience in executive government, what I've learned on this journey, and some thoughts for those who may follow. Many of these are things I wish I knew when I came into this place many years ago. The first and most fundamental lesson is that the lifeblood of politics is imagination and ideas. And what I've learned is that the real opposition in government is not the opposition, it's the status quo. The status quo is like a safety blanket, comfortable and familiar. But comfort doesn't lead to progress. To make the future better, you need ideas that challenge the way things are. Some think that being a conservative is about clinging to the past. To me, it's about understanding the immense value of the best of the past and carrying it with you to build a better future. It's about preserving what is good and innovating everything else. And that is why our government had so many firsts. The state's first future fund, the first one-stop shop for government services, Australia's first metro, second, third and fourth. Governments, and especially ministers, shouldn't just accept things the way they are simply because that's the way it's always been. I now believe the most important question a minister can ask is why? Why do school hours have to be from 9 to 3? Why does Canberra run GPs but states run hospitals? Why does the Cahill Expressway actually even exist? Asking why makes you challenge things that are just part of the furniture. Like, why do you pay the government on average $75,000 in stamp duty just to buy a home? Originally, it was a little admin fee to get some documents stamped. Today, it's a dead weight on the Australian dream, stamping out any chance of owning a home. Now, just imagine, to prove this point, if the situation was reversed. Imagine if the status quo today was paying a small levy each year to help fund state services. But then the government proposed to replace that small annual amount with a hefty upfront tax on average of $75,000. That government would probably lose every single seat in this parliament. Now, Mr. Speaker, major reform takes time and you need to bring the public on the journey. Our approach, giving first home buyers the option to pay an annual amount, was incredibly popular, particularly with young people, and began the process of normalising a new system. In the election, we committed to extending it to give first home buyers that choice for life, and if we were successful, we would have rolled it out more broadly. Over time, it would increase home ownership rates, boost economic productivity, and become the new norm. Now, Mr. Speaker, I also believe that for big ideas to take hold, ministers need to be bold. Mike Baird deserves credit for fostering an environment where ministers regularly spoke at policy forums and debated ideas beyond their responsibilities and outside of government policy. I enjoyed debating Rob Stokes, wherever he is, and obviously beating Rob Stokes in public debates on architecture, city planning and development. But by doing this, we also became our own opposition. And ultimately, regardless of whose side of the argument you were on, you ultimately ended up supporting a Liberal, Mr. Speaker. I once wrote an op-ed listing the 10 buildings in Sydney I wanted to knock down as part of my crusade to bring beauty back to architecture. And the good news today is we've knocked one of them down and there are 9 to go. Now, I think ministers, Mr. Speaker, should give 2 headline speeches each year on issues they are passionate about because it encourages critical thinking, cultivates public discourse and ultimately leads to better policy. You just got to make sure you give the Premier's office 5 minutes notice so they can't say they weren't informed. Now, Mr. Speaker, the LA should have more dedicated time where policy ideas can be debated. A lot of time in this place is spent on day-to-day business like private member statements, formalities and community recognition notices. But there is no real avenue for members to discuss the substantive issues facing our state and our country outside the boundaries of predictable partisan politics. Our civic life would be all the richer if Parliament was a genuine battleground of ideas and elected officials genuinely debated them. Now, when it comes to new ideas, I've learnt that sometimes it's not your place to finish big reforms, but only to start the journey. For example, John Hewson started the GST and John Howard finished it. So that's why I know the days of problem gambling in this state are numbered. It's now a matter of when, not if. And I look forward to the day these machines of misery in their factories of despair are no longer feeding off some of the most vulnerable people in our state. Yes. I've also learnt that achieving major change in politics requires fighting a war against the invisible. Now, while you might imagine a better future, most people are just busy enough with the here and now. And if change means disruption, it's hard for some to see the vision beyond the dust and rubble. But this isn't new. While construction was underway on the Opera House, critics panned the project, calling it a second-rate building and a piece of Danish pastry. Now, also, Service New South Wales was going to kill off those precious motor registries that apparently everyone loved. I never understood it. Well, thank goodness it did. The M2 was labelled as the road to nowhere, and the then Transport Minister Bruce Baird even received bullets in his letterbox. Yesterday's controversy becomes today's comfortable. And that's why I believe one of the most important roles of a politician is to have vision. A vision of the future we need to get to, and the determination to prosecute the case that in the long term it will all be worth it. Now, just the other day, I was in Melbourne and I received a notification on my phone from Uber saying it had been 8 years since my first journey. And it took me back to a time when Uber was not legal in New South Wales. And as a young minister, I gave a speech where I called for its legalisation. Now, the place went into meltdown. Alan Jones was off his rocker. He said I was a lefty masquerading in the Liberal Party. Perrottet, whatever you want to call yourself. You should not be supporting Uber as he called it. Now, ultimately, a year later, Mike Baird legalised Uber, and Alan was meant to be here today, but he probably couldn't get a Uber here. Now, Mr. Speaker, the second lesson is that ministers should not be passengers of the public service. It's so easy to end up being a hamster on some government department's wheel, and before you know it, your time in this place is over. And it's a trap I fell into early on, and my first meeting with the department still haunts me. I walked into a boardroom packed full of public servants. There were folders overflowing the desk, stuffed with briefing after briefing on all these department initiatives that all of a sudden had become my initiatives. So diligently, I toiled away all day, late into the night, but no matter how many folders I got through, more folders would appear. And before long, I'd realised I'd simply become a barrister for the department. Not only had I adopted their agenda wholesale, but I found myself passionately advocating for it in Cabinet, even when I absolutely disagreed with it. So we turned this all around, and we made the department put our agenda at the top of the list and on the front of the folder. And the department couldn't have meetings on their agenda until they reported on the implementation of ours. Now, this is not a criticism of the public service, but rather a byproduct of them bringing an agenda in the absence of one from a minister. Ministers must be persistent and determined as well to hold the public sector to account for implementing reforms, because even simple ideas can face immense resistance. I was shocked early on in my career to learn that the New South Wales government actually still issued cheques. And in fact, we even had people in my department whose job it was to lick the stamps for the envelopes that the cheques were to be sent in. So I asked my department for a drop-dead date from which no more government cheques would ever be issued. Now, they informed me this would be a very complex task and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, but they promised, I'm very supportive of the public service, and I know there's many here. Love you all. But they promised that they would investigate this very difficult task and report back to me. And I remember joking to my chief of staff when we were about to walk into a meeting with them a few weeks later that we were about to get a 10-page slide deck on why it couldn't be done. But I was wrong. We received a 20-page slide deck on why it couldn't be done. Anyway, so we just went out and announced an end date for issuing cheques anyway, and sure enough, guess what? It turned out it could be done, and New South Wales began banking like everyone else in the 21st century. For me, one of the big lessons in reform was that you must focus on implementation just as much as on the original idea. It's a lesson I learnt the hard way with our workers' compensation reforms. To be clear, the old system didn't work and almost bankrupted our state. The losers of that system were the injured workers who needed support. We wanted to fix it, And whilst our intentions were right, it's fair to say the implementation was not. It's an important reminder that with reform, the job is never finished. There is always more to do, to fix and to improve. I also believe that the public service doesn't actually want ministers to be passengers. They want to be engaged and get things done. A project that I was incredibly passionate about was revitalising Macquarie Street East, which connects the urban side of the city to the greenery of the Domain. And the first project to get off the ground was putting a bar on top of the State Library. Now, this was immediately opposed by New South Wales Labor, who said we were privatising the Mitchell Library. And then the Arts Minister at the time, after what I would say was just like the slightest bit of public pressure, capitulated and scrapped it. But following the election, I quietly sat down with the new State Librarian, John Vallance, who's here, a brilliant public servant, and we agreed that we would just do it anyway and not let anyone know. Until it kind of just like appeared, as it did. And so now we have one of the best rooftop bars anywhere in the world right here in Sydney. And it's not just a bar, it's a celebration of Sydney's history and beauty. And now, despite opposing it from Labor, every Thursday night Labor are up there having their drinks after Parliament, even birthday parties. Happy birthday, Sam. And who knows, they might even hold their little state conference there one day too. We should actually outsource the running of that bar, but I won't use there. Mr. Speaker, you want an engaged public service who can give you frank and fearless advice, but they also want ministers to set the vision so the public service can get on with their job of making New South Wales a much better place. A third lesson is the importance of getting out of the Macquarie Street bubble, ditching the formal policy briefs and meeting people where they are, listening to their stories in their own communities. The impact of their challenges and trials are all the more real when you see it with your own eyes and if only for a moment walk in their footsteps. You learn stuff on the ground that no neatly documented brief can bring to life. And I found this incredibly helpful in the development of our response to the flooding in the Northern Rivers. On arriving in Lismore, I had never seen such devastation. But with the ugly and brutal destruction of homes, livelihoods and communities, the beauty of friends and strangers coming together, determined to help others, was even more powerful. I saw the very best of the Australian spirit, the selflessness, the spirit of service. That will stay with me forever, and the people of Lismore will always have a special place in my heart. Yeah. But importantly, the community made a significant difference to the recovery. The Reconstruction Authority was established and shaped by the days, weeks and months we spent on the ground listening. Ultimately, the response was community-led, not government-directed, and it was all the better because of it. I want to acknowledge all the local members who represented their communities with distinction during that time, particularly Janelle Saffin, the Mayor Steve Krieg, and I want to thank Steph Cook and Paul Toole for the work that they did during that time, and Alicia McCumsty in my office. Mr. Speaker, our very popular Active Kids is another example. In that case, it was about listening to mums and dads at the sidelines of sporting games where I spend a lot of my Saturdays, and hearing again and again the cost of sports and uniforms was a major issue facing families. Now, after we introduced that policy, I was out in South Windsor and met a grandmother there who introduced me to her granddaughter who had just finished her first ever game of netball. She told me that the club had donated the uniform, and as a result of this program, she now could afford the costs of registration. Active Kids didn't cost much in the scheme of things, but it made a big difference to many children and led to the development of further programs like Learn to Swim, Creative Kids and Back to School vouchers. There was a reason, Mr. Speaker, why people have different views, but there was a reason why we didn't means test those family support policies. And that's because income is not the sole determinant of wealth or capacity to pay. It's the middle class in this country that pays the lion's share of tax and don't ask for or get very much in return. These policies were designed to help all families in New South Wales. That's exactly what they did. Another example of a policy informed by first-hand experience was our record palliative care investment, designed with direct engagement with frontline nurses. Every person across New South Wales deserves access to the best care at a time when it matters most. As a minister, I also found it helpful to get a greater understanding of the important work of the public service by visiting frontline staff myself. But I occasionally liked to rock up unannounced. There was one day after reports that I was going to privatise the stonemasons, which I may or may not have been planning to do, we decided that we would visit the stonemasons at their stone yard in Alexandria. I'm going to keep going. Is that all right, Mr. Smith?
Well, I was wondering if you had noticed, but
We're getting through it.
I
I haven't made many contributions.
Dom,
since
how
election.
much do you need? What do you need?
I don't know, 7 more pages.
As long as it takes.
Yeah, take us up to 5. Go on.
Okay, we'll keep going. Thanks, Mr. Speaker, for your indulgence. Lost my place. Anyway, stonemasons. Yeah, so we arrived unannounced mid-morning, and the place was deadly quiet. There was tumbleweed rolling around the yard. We buzzed at the gate, and at first they wouldn't let us in as they thought it was a prank. We finally got through, and this bright young woman who looked a little shocked came out, let us into this office, walked down this long corridor, and said, "Now, can you just stay here for a little while?" I was like, "Yeah, no worries." 30 minutes later, sitting there, I was getting pretty bored of looking at the Vote 1 green stickers that they obviously hadn't had time to take down before I arrived, Mr. Speaker. Anyway, she eventually returns 30 minutes later, and she takes us on this tour of the yard, which was now buzzing with activity. I mean, workers had appeared from everywhere, and the noise from the machines was absolutely deafening. Anyway, after we concluded this very impressive tour, we got back into the car, and my media advisor, who didn't join us, had hung by the car, was laughing in the back seat. I said, what's so funny? He said, well, after you walked down that long corridor and were stuck in the office, that young woman came running out. And she said, Perrottet's here, start the engines. So the moral of the story is, if you want to know what's going on, just don't tell them you're coming. And you will learn a lot. And in fairness, as I did that very day, and was so impressed with their work that we decided to keep the stonemasons in public hands. The fourth lesson, Mr. Speaker, and something else I wish I knew earlier, is that while ministerial responsibilities can seem daunting, there are plenty of people who are willing to give you good advice. You only have to ask. Now, I found it useful throughout my career to learn from others who had gone before me. Former Prime Minister John Howard was a constant source of wisdom. He encouraged me to take a real focus on those who don't have a voice or a lobby group. Middle Australia, the forgotten people of Robert Menzies. But I learned a lot from the other side too. Former Prime Minister Paul Keating encouraged me to realise the power of imagination in politics. And he once said to me, Dom, I had to teach my bastards to care about money, and you need to teach your bastards to care about people. Now, this may sound strange because obviously John and Paul are completely different, but sometimes I feel like I'm their political love child. Now, Mr. Speaker, I also found it useful to have an office environment where staff could give me honest feedback and criticism, sometimes constant criticism. My staff were never shy about letting me know how I was doing, especially in my public appearances. Eventually, I could just tell by the look on their faces when I came into the office. But I also found it helpful to get perspectives from outside of government and politics. For example, consulting industry leaders and establishing a business advisory group to gain insights and advice. And during the pandemic, this group became absolutely vital in our development of a range of financial packages. Now, COVID was a health crisis, but it was an economic crisis too. I saw firsthand the double-edged sword created by government policy, and we are still seeing some of the impacts of that period today. My credit goes to former Premier Gladys Berejiklian for fostering an environment where senior ministers could discuss and debate our response from various perspectives during daily crisis cabinet meetings. This approach helped New South Wales address the health needs of our people while remaining more open and more free than other states. Now, as hard and as challenging as that period was, it was incredibly, incredibly rewarding to work alongside such dedicated ministers and public servants. Now, whilst we didn't always agree, and in fact often disagreed, Brad, everyone's perspective was fairly considered, and I believe led New South Wales to having one of the strongest responses, not just in the country, but globally. I got to witness what others didn't. A dedicated group of people who worked around the clock doing everything they could to help our people through. And it was a real team effort. Gladys, Brad Hazard, John Barilaro, Stuart Ayres, and Victor Dominello, supported by Tim Reardon, Kate Boyd, Mike Pratt, Susan Pearce, Elizabeth Koff, Kerry Chant, Emma Hogan, and Mick Fuller. Now, while we didn't get everything right, I believe we got more right than wrong. And without dwelling on every decision we got wrong, I believe it's important to point out one mistake which was made by governments here and around the world, and that was the strict enforcement of vaccine mandates. Health officials and governments were acting with the right intentions to stop the spread. But if the impact of vaccines on transmission was limited at best, as is now mostly accepted, the law should have left more room for respect of freedom. Vaccines saved lives, but ultimately mandates were wrong. People's personal choices shouldn't have cost them their jobs. When I became Premier, we removed them, or the ones we actually could, but this should have happened faster. And if a pandemic comes again, we need to get a better balance, encouraging people to take action, whilst at the same time protecting people's fundamental liberty. The final thing I wish I learned earlier in politics was how effective it can be working across political and jurisdictional lines. As a Member of Parliament, you're not paid by your party. You're paid by the taxpayers who elected you. The temptation in opposition is to just oppose, to choose politics over what's right. But you don't need to compromise your convictions to work with all parties to get things done. There is much we can do in a bipartisan way to drive our state and nation forward, and I'm grateful to have had the opportunities to be part of such efforts. For example, establishing the Board of State Treasurers not only united the politicians from both sides, but the public service as well, breaking down the silos across the Federation. Now, this body proved to be incredibly important during the pandemic, where we shared what worked and what didn't, and we were able to help each other in developing our financial and economic responses. It also led to the states having a more proactive role in driving rather than responding to the then COAG agenda by finding common ground between the state treasurers. We were able to get Canberra to commit to legislating the no worse off clause following changes to the GST distribution model, which that change, I believe, was the worst public policy decision since 1851. Why 1851? Because that's when this Parliament passed a law to create a separate colony of Victoria. just days before the Victorian Gold Rush began. Call me a cynic, but there was something going on there. The Victorians were hiding the gold. That's worth about $150 billion today. So just imagine if that decision wasn't made. New South Wales would have all the gold. There would be no Victoria. Canberra wouldn't exist. And Sydney would be the nation's capital, as it always should have been. Now, despite the issues of Victoria, I still thought it was important to work in a bipartisan way with the premiers. And you probably couldn't get two people more philosophically different than Dan Andrews and me. Dictator Dan and Domicron. Working together, Mr. Speaker, but we worked together in the pandemic to develop and reform policy in the areas of pre-school education and healthcare. Now, unfortunately, we don't see this bipartisan relationship at the federal level. Good policy is suffocated by bad politics. It's all short-termism all the time. And we are failing to meet the moment on a number of fronts, with Canberra becoming a cemetery of reform. Asia is rising, and there is a significant risk that Australia will be left behind. And if we don't address this with courage and conviction, then our future prosperity is at risk. Doing nothing is a choice that we cannot afford to make, and a well-run federation is key to securing a prosperous future. Federation is the operating system of our country, and we must get it right. And if we established Australia today, no one in their right mind would set up the federation the way it is. We currently have federal and state health systems that don't even work alongside each other, rather they actively work against each other. And if we can't reform the federal health system after a 1 in 100 year pandemic, we never will. The federal government's creeping encroachment as well into service delivery has been an abject failure. The NBN, the NDIS, BER and Pink Bats all demonstrate the challenges of running nationwide delivery programs across diverse states from Canberra. Now, Paul Keating said, never get in the way of a premier and a bucket of cash. Well, I would say always get in the way of a Prime Minister and a federally funded fiasco. The challenges that we face as a nation are complex, and they can't be solved by one level of government, one public service department, or just one side of politics. The federal government needs to set the vision, and the states need to be held accountable for implementation, tailoring solutions with a local focus. Prime Ministers, Premiers and Treasurers may have the best intentions, but they don't have an environment where policies for the long-term benefit of our country can be developed. And it certainly can't occur with a revolving door of leaders sitting around the National Cabinet or Federal Treasurers' meetings. So here's what I propose. To create the right conditions for fully effective federation reform, we need to move to a harmonised election cycle. Firstly, immediately move at a federal level to 4-year fixed terms. This gives them more time on reforming and less time on campaigning. Secondly, we need continuity at a state level. So the states and territories should move to 4-year fixed terms held within 6 months of the midpoint of the federal electoral term. This will allow state premiers and treasurers to work together and collaborate across party lines over a 4-year period to improve financial and service delivery arrangements, driving economic prosperity. The division of responsibility should also be re-examined, with the federal government acting more as a financing arm for state service delivery. Incentives should be in place for states that reform, and we should have a fund set up by the federal government to help facilitate it. The federal government should also determine consistent metrics and establish league tables where states can be publicly compared on outcomes, particularly in the areas of health, education and housing. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and comparability will drive state accountability. This is a blueprint for future reform of the Federation, but more importantly, it's a blueprint for the future success of our nation and its people. Now to some acknowledgements, Mr. Speaker. I couldn't have served the people of New South Wales without the support of so many incredible people. Firstly, to the communities of Castle Hill, Hawkesbury and Epping, who I had the good fortune of representing, it has been a privilege to serve you. To the Liberal conferences and all of those who have supported me, in Castle Hill, particularly David and Wendy Faulkner-Dick, Will Darby, Rick Alogia, Pat Doherty, Tim and Jared Abrams, Les and Jill Dybel. In Hawkesbury, particularly Bob and Judy Newland, John and Margaret Berenschott and Sean Fannin. In Epping, it's a bit long because I've had 3, sorry. In Epping, Ross Barwick, Michael Macaulay and especially Damien Tudorhope, whose friendship I've greatly valued. To the public service, but particularly the secretaries I had good fortune of working with, Martin Hoffman, Rob Whitfield, Mike Pratt, David Deverell and Michael Cootes-Trotter. I want to give a special shout out to New South Wales Treasury, hands down the best Treasury in the country. One of the things I loved about Treasury was how diligent they were in fact-checking almost everything I said. We used to actually send them out question time responses so they could verify economic and financial figures, and I once included a line saying that I was the best treasurer in the history of the state, to which they wrote back, we are unable to verify this claim. Just on Treasury, and you're doing a great job, just on Treasury, I get to see them next week, as an aside, forecasting, and Mike Beadle knows this really well, forecasting is their biggest challenge. And I believe the Treasurer should be the one that makes the forecast within, and be accountable for that, within a range set by Treasury. But anyway, we won't go into that. To the press gallery, we've had a greater turnover rate whilst I've been here than premiers, but I particularly want to thank the editors of the papers, particularly Ben English and Bevan Shields. To my ministerial colleagues, too many to mention. So many of you have been a great source of support and counsel in good times and in bad. To the National Party, and in particular my Deputy Premier Paul Toole, your efforts always ensured that New South Wales, the regional New South Wales, had a seat at the cabinet table. Sometimes I wished it was actually just that, one seat at the cabinet table, one seat. But I've seen firsthand the passion of the National Party, and they will always be the party of regional New South Wales, just not in Albury, Goulburn, Port Macquarie, and Wagga Wagga. But I wish Dougal and his team all the very best. I would like to thank the Liberal Party. I'd really like to thank the Liberal Party for giving me the opportunity to contribute to public life, especially Chris Stone for his support over many years and during the election. I wish Richard Shields all the best in his new job. Good luck. I'd like to wish Premier Chris Minns and the government all the very best. I would just like to wish Mark Speakman all the very better, and his leadership team led by Natalie Ward, Damien Tudhope, Robin Preston and Alistair Henskins all the best. To those in the Business Advisory Group and other industry leaders who are always available to impart their wisdom and advice, David Gonski, Matthew Grounds, Michael Carapiet, Susan Lloyd-Horwitz, Vivek Bhatia, Frank Calabria, Tim Sims, Luke Mangan, Luke Mackey and Justin Hems, among many. Thank you very much. My personal protection team, who all became very good mates, Adam Leach, Ritson Renshaw, Chris Moore, Tim Black, Sam Carroll, Will Cook, Corey Kinsella and Luca Opmura. My drivers, but particularly Tim Dwyer, who my kids called Tim Driver, and given the amount of time we spent together, they started to refer to Tim as Dad's best friend. That's pretty sad, actually. No, I love you, Tim. I love you, Tim. I would like to thank all of those who worked in my electorate offices who carried a massive load, particularly over the 9 years that I served as a minister. To my ministerial staff, to Charis, the most exceptional EA anyone could ever have. She knew what I was going to do before I knew what I was going to do. Tim Cannon, my brilliant speechwriter, whose words captured wit, heart and depth, and obviously after this speech I'm clearly missing him. To Monica Tudhope, one of the best policy minds we had in government, an architect of the 5 best budgets this state has ever seen. Treasury can fact check that. I want to especially thank my chiefs of staff, Steve Joseph and Brand Black, but I particularly want to thank Nigel Freitas. He has been my right-hand man for my entire political career. So to Nigel, can I say your unwavering loyalty and dedication has been invaluable, and you can be incredibly proud of the contribution that you made to New South Wales. To all my other staffers, there are too many to mention. Ben Wicks, Euron, Ben Eyre, Julia, Juliet, Michelle. If I start, and I've already started, and I'm going to relate people out. So all of you, can I say that I count myself so very fortunate to have been surrounded by such brilliant, inquisitive minds and passionate, energetic people who just got things done. To Mum and Dad for making so many sacrifices for me and my siblings and giving us every opportunity in life and instilling in us the Catholic values of service and sacrifice. To Chelsea and the Griffin family, whose support has carried our family for many years. To my 7 amazing children who I dearly love, Charlotte, Amelia, Annabelle, William, Harriet, Beatrice and Celeste. There is nothing more important in my life than you. It is so wonderful over the last decade to see your personalities and little characters develop and flourish over these years. I'm so very proud of each of you. Finally, to my beautiful wife, Helen, being married to a politician is hard. Being married to me is harder. I've never properly appreciated or thanked you for the sacrifices that you have made for me, for our family, and putting your own career on hold to support mine. You carried the mental load at home for so many years, whilst continuing to work, toiling away late at night as a major in the Australian Defence Force. Always stayed up when the kids went to bed and rose before they woke. You made so many sacrifices and such selfless love and care over all these years. I can now understand why you seemed so happy during my concession speech on election night. But from the bottom of my heart, can I thank you? And on behalf of the people of New South Wales, can I thank you as well? I love you so very much. Finally, I want to thank all of those who have been part of my journey and helped me along the way. You are and will always be incredibly special to me. Thank you for everything. Mr. Speaker, it has been an absolute honour and privilege to be a member of this place. I am going to miss it very much. I got into politics not to review, but to reform, and I'm so very proud to have been part of a government that has completely reshaped our city and state. Politics is about winning the future, and you do that by having ideas, and may the best ideas win. Thank you.